Welcome to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. I'm Matthew of castingacross.com, where I explore the quarry and culture of fly fishing. Hey, a real quick PSA on the front end of this 291st episode of the podcast. Usually at the end of every episode, I say something to the effect of leave ratings and reviews on iTunes. But looking at statistics of who's listening to the podcast, a lot of you are utilizing Spotify. And if that is the case, if you don't mind, take a minute, tap on those stars that are wherever they are around the podcast image and description on your app. And that way, that will boost the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast on Spotify, getting it in front of more eyes and then ultimately more ears. And because a lot of my best ideas about 20 minutes worth of content come from interactions with listeners, this can only make the podcast better. And so if you have a minute, I would appreciate if you would go ahead and do that. Thank you in advance. So this week on the podcast, we're talking about a trip that I recently took and how that got me thinking about some things that really sparked into my mind as I was preparing to fish, as I was fishing, and here in hindsight, 24 hours away from getting back home. So I did 4 days on the Delaware River system. I stayed on the west branch of the Delaware River, which is in New York and then flows along the border of Pennsylvania, where it meets up with the east branch, which flows out of New York and meets up in a town called Hancock, New York. And then the main stem of the Delaware flows down and between New York and Pennsylvania for quite a ways, ultimately going through New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and emptying out into the Chesapeake Bay. Well, take that back, into the Atlantic Ocean. But then the other rivers that are around there, the Willamette and the Beaverkill, I spent some time on the Beaverkill, and then at the junction pool where the Beaverkill and the Willamette come together are also outstanding trout fisheries. But really, the West Branch is where I spent the bulk of my time because those fish are incredibly hard fighting trout. I've caught big fish in tailwaters in the south, in the TVA tailwaters, caught big fish up in Maine and other parts of New England, as well as big fish in some other areas of the eastern United States. And for my estimation, I would say that those fish on the west branch of the Delaware are the hardest fighting trout around. And this is a great area because really in like 6 hours, you can be, Boston, DC, Pittsburgh, even Cleveland, and make it to, Buffalo and make it to this area and gets into some world-class trout fishing. And because it's a tailwater, you're going to have access to that as long as the season is open to angling. But we're not going to talk about the West Branch in too much detail. I will use it as examples because that's where I was. But if you want more information about fishing the West Branch of the Delaware, East Branch, Willamette, Beaverkill, those other rivers, the main stem of the Delaware, then stay tuned to the end of this podcast because I'm going to refer you to some resources where you can get that information. But like I said, we talk about some things that I thought about in preparation, thought about while I was fishing, and I thought about after I have come home that may be beneficial to you. And the first one is, it might sound silly, but have you ever been in a situation where you've just tied on a streamer and then trout start rising in front of you? Now, is this a dilemma, like capital D dilemma, like life-altering, anxiety-inducing kind of situation? Hopefully not. Hopefully your life isn't such that the kind of fly you are fishing to fish with is causing you that sort of stress and discomfort. But this got me thinking that, I wanted to catch fish on dry flies. And by and large, I was able to do that wherever I wanted and whenever I wanted for the last 4 days. There were certainly times where fish were feeding much more aggressively and keying in on surface flies, not surface film flies, which that might be something else we talk about today. And so it was very, very easy to make that decision. But for a lot of the places I fish around here, I'm able to fish streamers and nymphs most of the time to great success. So fishing the Delaware, going on this trip, fishing with dry flies was one of my top priorities. And so one of the things that I was thinking about as I was fishing streamers and then switching to dry flies repeatedly, which involved going from maybe that 4X tippet to that 6X tippet. So there was time where I was looking at my flies, looking at my tippet, tying knots, thinking, is this worth all this effort? And the answer for me was absolutely. Why was that? Because, like I said, I had this desire to catch fish on dry flies, and I had this desire to make that effort to catch large fish on dry flies. And I was thankfully rewarded for it. Now, over the course of the days I was fishing, the fish I was catching on streamers were by and large larger on average. But I was still catching big fish on dry flies. In fact, I caught the biggest fish of the trip, on dry flies. And so what I had done was said that when this opportunity presents itself, I'm not going to fish randomly to, rising fish that are popping up here and there intermittently, but when fish start feeding consistently on the surface, I'm going to cut off my streamer, cut off my nymphs that I might be getting some action with, and I'm going to switch over to dry flies because I wanted to cast and present and hook fish that were feeding in that way. Now, for you, it might be totally a matter of pragmatics, like how, or pragmatism would be the word, right? Yeah. It might be totally about that, where you're like, you don't care, you just want to catch fish. But if that's something that you are looking to do, because you simply want to do it in one way, you want to develop your skills in one way, or like I was saying before, you don't often get to do that on the waters that you fish at home, or your normal fishing, then I would say make that commitment to do it. I'm going to fish this type of way whenever the opportunity presents itself as much as I can. Doesn't mean that I have to commit to it. Doesn't mean that I can't, push the other types of fishing a little bit more. But if this situation comes up, I'm going to make a decision to fish this way. And what does that do for you? One, well, you look back and say, I did what I wanted to do, because at the end of the day, you cannot control how many fish you catch. Now, you certainly have something to say about it, as far as are you being diligent in the way that you are covering water? Are you making proper presentations, both with fly selection as well as casting and mending? Are you fishing as much as you are able to? Those are things you can control, but you can't make fish bite. It just isn't going to happen. And even if you are matching the hatch, even if you're putting it right in front of them, they aren't necessarily going to respond in the way that you want them to. So at the end of the day, if you look back on a trip and you have, either not so great or moderate or really, really high success rates, what are you able to say? You say, I fished the way I wanted to fish, or are you going to say, I did everything I could and I still didn't catch fish, which was frustrating because I didn't even do what I wanted to do. So that's the first thing I was thinking about. I made this commitment. I'm going to fish dry flies as much as possible. And it worked out really well. The issue, though, was the sheer volume of insect life. And this is definitely a blessing and a curse. If you're somewhere where the hatches are a little bit sporadic and you look around and there's olives flying around, and then you see some fish starting to rise, you can be pretty confident that we're talking about blue-wing olives. But the amount of insects that were not only flying, but at some points in times just completely covering the water was remarkable. It was astounding, the variety of shape, of color, of size, of species of not only mayfly but also caddisfly and stoneflies as well. This time of year there wasn't a whole bunch of terrestrials, so you didn't have to worry about that necessarily. Although there certainly were ants that were falling in the water and being eaten by fish. There's an amazing amount of bank feeders, even with all of the mayflies that were flitting about. There was fish that were up against the bank, inevitably chasing ants and other stuff as they fell in. But this leads me to, one, just a reminder of the amazing healthy ecosystem that they have going on there. But secondly, I find, and this is something that you may argue vehemently against, that profile or silhouette is as important as color. So if you are trying to fill up your fly box, I think there's a lot of wisdom in trying to match the hatch, having those flies that best represent those bugs that are going to be out there at any given point in time. But especially if there's a little bit of chop on the water, especially if there's a lot of options for the fish to pick from, then having a fly that has a silhouette or has a profile that matches what the fish are eating, I think that is much more important, and a lot of much wiser and more experienced and more productive anglers than I have said this. I think that trumps matching the pattern perfectly. So, great example. there were sulfurs about, so it's not unprecedented to say that the trout may have thought that that they were eating a sulfur, but the amount of olives that were flying around were much, much more prodigious. But I did not have a crippled olive pattern on me. I did, and I either lost it or it was like a little CDC pattern that was riding really, really low in the water. I didn't like it. I had a couple of those. I just didn't like fishing them. I couldn't see them as the light was getting lower. I couldn't see them with the chop that was in the water. So I found a sulfur pattern that had it was a crippled sulfur pattern. So the hackle was at a bit of a 45-degree angle to the hook. It had a big parachute post, and then it had a little bit of a scraggly tail to give it some, first of all, so that it would ride the right way in the water and make sure that it was suspended below the surface film. And the fish reacted to that fly. Now, why was that? It was yellow, and the bugs that were flitting about were kind of, grayish olive. But especially in that low light and in the shade, in the middle of the day, so in the middle of the day in the shade, but then later in the day when the light was starting to get low, what was that fly doing? It was presenting the profile that those fish were into. It was on faster water. It was a fly that they could see coming up, and even though they could see it coming up and saw that it was a little bit of a different color than the flies that they may have been intending to feed on, the profile and the silhouette that it presented was much more effective. Because I tried fishing just standard, split wing dry flies of olives. I tried to, the duns and then even the spinners, and they just weren't cutting it. And so I had to switch over to a sulfur pattern that was when this cripple, and that really, really produced. And it just goes to show that presentation trumps over pattern more often than not. Same thing was true when I was fishing some nymphs on a really deep riffle. I wanted to fish a beadhead pheasant tail that had a little bit more of a buggy profile than anything I had in my box. Just looking through all of my pheasant tails, either I just forgot to bring them or I fished them all and I haven't replaced them. But all of my pheasant tails that I had were very, very streamlined, very, very tight little patterns. And I wanted something that had kind of a fatter wing case, or maybe even some feathers that came out that looked a little bit like legs. I didn't have that. So I found this, I didn't even know what it was, but it looked like a wet fly with a bead head. But it was in pheasant tail colors. And dropping that thing down in there, and they responded great to it. So again, the profile is so important. The silhouette is so important, and then presenting it properly. And I'm a firm believer that if you present a fly well, then you can be very, very off. Not necessarily throwing a stimulator when they're feeding off delicate little mayflies, but even that, you grease or lube up a stimulator with tons and tons of floatant and get that thing to skate on its hackle tips, make a very, very good cast, make sure it doesn't get waterlogged. And those fish will pursue that fly, even though it is the polar opposite of what they're looking for. Maybe the big old foam Chernobyl ant isn't going to do the trick when they're feeding on mayfly spinners, but you're able to use caddis patterns and you're able to use small stonefly patterns if you fish them right and fish them well within a certain margin of error. And so that's where I would say when it comes to filling up your fly box, I think that for the flies that I accumulated for this trip, I tried to diversify the patterns, and what I should have done is just stuck with one bug, either BWOs or with sulfurs, and just found things all across the size and shape spectrum to make sure I didn't have any gaps in that. But as it stood, I kind of had little things here and there, some random flies, some March Browns, some big green drakes, things like that, where I probably would have been better served sticking with one color and just making sure I had every body shape, body size, life cycle stage of those of those flies. Another thing that I wanted to mention is, and this goes back to what I was saying before, there's the East Branch, the Main Stem, the West Branch, the Beaverkill, the Willamette. We bounced around a lot, and we fished a lot of different places. And truth be told, there were big chunks of the day that were not super productive. It was very, very, very sunny, and you would find isolated fish that were actively feeding, and it was kind of hit or miss, to be honest, during the highest sun hours. But then things would really start to turn up, both for dry flies, streamers, nymphs, once the sun started going behind clouds or once the sun started to go down. And so it wasn't as if we were leaving fish to find fish. That's something that I would never advocate. That being said, if you want to fish different rivers, like for example, you have one day and in the area I just mentioned, and you want to have a little bit of time in each spot, go for it. There's nothing wrong with that. If there's no law against it, you're able to go and fish each spot for, an hour and a half, then by all means do so. And you can do that reasonably within a day and get the best of those fisheries. Are you necessarily going to be able to prospect well and plumb the depths of what those fisheries each have to offer? Probably not. But you're also, to truth be told, not going to necessarily do that on any one of those rivers if you spent an entire day on each one. And so we bounced around a lot, and it was a lot of fun. One, we got to see new places just in the area, which was fun. We went to some parts of the East Branch and parts of the Beaverkill that we'd never been before. So that was really cool. And in doing so, we were able to fish in some different spots. So not only seeing different scenery, but fish in different places. And that was a lot of fun because you pop up in a spot and you find a pool and there's fish rising because of the thickly lined stream banks, where even though there was high sun, there was enough shade where those fish were responding a little bit differently. And so it paid off. So there's this great kind of aesthetic touristy aspect to it, but at the same time, bouncing around, finding spots allowed us to fish in different ways at different times when it wouldn't have necessarily been the most productive thing to just muscle it out and stay in one spot. What that also does is it builds in some breaks. So I feel like I'm in pretty decent shape. I run, I hike, I do all sorts of manual labor when it presents itself to me. But honestly, after a day of bombing out really long casts on the Delaware River, I was pretty sore, and I would imagine that I would be even more sore if I didn't have these little breaks here and there, hopping in the car, drinking a coffee, driving for 15 minutes to go to a different spot. It really forces you to take a breather, and it forces you to get a little bit of a rest. And there is nothing wrong with that. The other thing that, in hindsight, I was thinking about is I was unpacking my car yesterday, looking at the 3 rods I brought. I brought a 8.5-foot 5-weight, I brought a 9-foot 6-weight, and I brought a 10.5-foot 3-weight Euro nymphing rod. Because I didn't know what I was going to be in for. Again, I already had this plan that I wanted to fish dry flies, but I brought all 3 of these rods. Now, all things being equal, that 8.5-foot 5-weight is my preferred dry fly rod. It is a very smooth casting, medium fast action rod with a very, very light in hand, very, very light swing rate profile that I absolutely love. It is by far my favorite dry fly rod that I own for medium to large trout rivers. The 9-foot 6-weight was going to be my if it's windy rod. If I end up throwing streamers more than I wanted, than I'd planned on rod. And of course, the Euro nymphing rod was if things just weren't working well, it was going to be my ace in the hole for getting into fish if they were really not wanting to play ball. And what ended up happening after fishing that 8.5-foot 5-weight for that first night, and then fishing that Euro nymphing rod for the first morning, I had to make longer casts. And I needed to be able to fish a wide range of fly sizes from the size 4 streamers all the way down to the size 22 midges, and that 9-foot 6-weight fit the bill. So although I drove around with the Euro nymphing rod and the 5-weight rigged up ready to roll, I used that 9-foot 6-weight more often than not. Now, do I regret carrying those other 2 rods around and their corresponding reels and the extra spools that went with those reels? Absolutely not. I think that is totally fine to do. It is better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. And there were times where, maybe that 8.5-foot 5-weight would have been a little bit better rod, but if I got further from the car, the versatility of that 9-foot 6-weight definitely came in handy. And what I even did for that first day was I carried that second rod with me. I carried it using my little rod holster that I have that Vitavu makes on my belt, and I carried that rod around with me for the first morning of the second day and up until lunchtime. But then I ended up just leaving it in the car. Took the fly off, reeled in the line, and I kept it in there. But it was good knowing that I had it in case, for example, we went to a smaller river again, and I needed to use something a little bit more finesse and more delicate on a little bit more closed-in space. But having that rod that could do everything was really, really helpful. And as I've said ad nauseum on this podcast, I don't think that I lost anything, even when I did catch those smaller fish, those 12-inch fish, when I had that 6-weight. I don't think that my experience would have been exponentially more exciting had I had that 5-weight. And in fact, some of the larger fish that I got into that were eating some of those smaller dry flies, I'm glad I had that 6-weight and I was able to get a little bit more muscle into them. In fact, I caught this shad, and had I had my 5-weight, I'd probably still be fighting that thing because the 5-weight is a little bit of a softer action and it is a little bit more delicate of a rod. But having that nice 6-weight to put, some muscle into that fish, I was able to land it even after a long, long, long fight. So, all said, there's plenty of other things that I thought of, but hopefully these are some good practical things for you to think about as you are preparing for your next trip. The first thing is set some goals for yourself and then stick with them within reason. Don't make yourself a slave to your rules. Secondly, make sure that your fly assortment is wide and varied across the life cycle and the profile options of any one particular fly pattern or color. Don't be afraid to bounce around. Don't be afraid to take a little ride to be able to experience everything that river has to offer. And make sure that you pack what you might need, and don't be afraid after you've tried a few things to only stick with one. There's no rule saying you bring 3 rods, you have to fish 3 rods the whole time. Now, a lot of this stuff is common sense. At the same time, we all have our blind spots. We have things that we just, I've always done it this way, or, I never thought about that. And so hopefully these things can be helpful to you. If you have questions about this area, again, I'm not the expert, but I can steer you in the right direction, either from what I do know or because of some of the guides and folks that I know that live and fish those waters hundreds and hundreds of days a year. So do let me know if you have any questions or about just my my trip preparing in general. I'm sure there's lots of content over at castingacross.com from the years past, but always happy to chime in as you are planning as well. With that said, let's talk about what came out this week on Casting Across. And on Monday, there is a post called Rusty Flybox Catskills. So this is really cool. So if you go to the website and you go to Rusty Flybox Catskills, just put Catskills in the search bar if you're looking for it. There's 3 things that you'll find. One is an article called The Hardest Fighting Trout Around, where I make the case for the Upper Delaware system's trout being absolute studs. Secondly, there is a video, Streams of Heritage, from the good folks over at Frequent Flyers Fly Fishing. You can just click on it on that page and watch it, or you can go to YouTube if you want to blow it up and make it bigger. And then thirdly, there is a direct link to the podcast, Why You Should Fish the Upper Delaware, where I talk about the Upper Delaware again in quick, broad strokes. This is a podcast. It doesn't say when it's from. I think it's probably it's all the way back in 2020. So I've fished it a number of times since then, and definitely know more, but this is still a good primer for you if you're at all interested. So that's all in one page over at castingacross.com, one post, Rusty Flybox Catskills. And Wednesday's article was called Cast, Catch, Release, Wading into Purpose. Cast, Catch, Release, Wading into Purpose. So this is a brand new book that came out this week, the first week of June 2024, by Marina Gibson. And it is an autobiographical account of her life and her entry into not just fly fishing, but in the fly fishing industry. And she weaves those 2 things together, as well as the life cycle of a salmon. It's a quick, fun read. One of my favorite aspects of it is it really humanizes the industry / influencer thing. I know there's so much bad stuff that one can say about it, but this gives a perspective of somebody who has gone through it. I mean, that's not what it's about, but if you're getting into fly fishing in the 2000s, that's part of it. And so this kind of talks through it. It's not heavy-handed in any way, but it's just a nice light read. So definitely check out my review of that book. And speaking of that book, this week's recommendation at castingacross.com is that you enter in to win a free copy of Cast, Catch, and Release by Marina Gibson. I'm looking at 5 copies in front of me, and if you want one of them, all you have to do to be eligible is to sign up for an email newsletter from Casting Across. I send out 1 email a week. It comes out on Tuesday, 1 p.m. Eastern. I'm not going to promise that I'm never going to send out another email if something else pops up, if I want to give away something or if I need something, then maybe I'll send another email. But for years and years and years, it's been one email every week on Tuesday, and all it is a quick synopsis of all three things that happen on Casting Across that week. One, podcast, two, articles. And so if you are only a podcast guy and you cannot be bothered to go to the website, you still sign up for this and you can just quickly see what came out on the articles that week in Casting Across. And in doing so, whether you do it on like Wednesday morning at 8:55 a.m. or you've been on the email list for years and years and years, then you will be eligible to win a copy of Cast, Catch, and Release. Excuse me, Cast, Catch, Release. There's no and there. That's superfluous. Thanks for listening to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. Please subscribe in your favorite podcast app and rate the podcast in iTunes and on Spotify. Then head over to castingacross.com for 3 posts a week on the people, places, and things that go into the pursuit of fish.